Tales of the Old Country. The letters he burned. Don Anselmo Quintero burned the letter without reading it, as he did every year, in the fire of the corridor, watching how the paper twisted until it became ash. For 40 years he had been doing the same thing each time one of those letters arrived with the Guadalajara postmark. And for 40 years he had kept silent about why. If you believe a man can carry a silence for a whole lifetime without that silence ending up collecting its account, subscribe to Tales of the Old Country and turn on the bell, because this story is for you. The sun was barely peeking over the agaves of his hacienda in the Altos of Jalisco when Anselmo realized, that morning, that his hands trembled more than usual. The hacienda of San Anselmo was large and always silent, as if the very air of those lands had learned to keep quiet so as not to bother the patron. Don Anselmo had been widowed young, had had no children he recognized, and lived alone with a handful of old farmhands and a cook, Doa Trinsata, who had been with him more than 30 years and who had never once heard him laugh in all that time. He was a fair man in business and hard in dealings, one of those who pay what they owe to the cent but don't give away even a smile, respected from afar and loved by no one up close. The people of the town said, in low voices in the atrium after Mass, that Don Anselmo guarded a secret, because a man doesn't become that dry without a reason weighing on his soul. But no one knew what it was, and it suited him, more than anything in the world, that it stay that way. Each morning he did exactly the same, with the stubbornness of someone clinging to a routine, so as not to think. He got up before dawn, when the sky of the Altos was still purple, sat in the same chair in the corridor, the cord chair that had been his father's and his father's father's, and watched the sun rise over the blue agaves without saying a word to anyone. Doa Trinsita brought him the steaming clay pot coffee in a clay jug. He drank it in silence, looking at the horizon, and then he saddled up and went out to ride the hacienda until the sun beat hard. 40 years of the same routine, the same chair, the same silence. 40 years of not looking back, because behind him there was something he didn't dare look at even sidelong. What no one knew, not even Doa Trinsita, who knew him like no one else, was what Don Anselmo kept in a little wooden box hidden beneath a loose board in the floor of his room. Unopened letters, dozens of letters tied with a cord, all with the same small, trembling hand. All with the Guadalajara postmark, all burned halfway or kept unread over 4 whole decades. And a rosary of black beads, worn from so much praying, that wasn't his, and that he didn't dare either touch or throw away. That morning, when Anselmo finished his coffee, Doa Trinsita told him that a young man had arrived on foot at the gate, asking for him, and that he'd been waiting since before dawn. "Let him go," said Anselmo, without raising his eyes. "I'm not expecting anyone." "He says he comes from Guadalajara," answered Doa Trinsita. "He says his name is Joaquin, and that he brings an errand from a woman who is dying." Anselmo went very still. The cup went cold in his hand. For a moment, the cook believed the patron hadn't heard, but then Anselmo got up. Slowly, as if every year of his life weighed on his shoulders all at once, and walked to the gate. The young man must have been about 20, thin, with the clothes dusty from the road, his hat in his hand. He had dark eyes and a way of looking that stirred something old in Anselmo's chest, something he didn't want to name. "Are you Don Anselmo Quintero?" asked the young man. "I am." "What do you want?" The young man took from his bag a letter, one more, with the same handwriting as always. But this time it wasn't sent by mail. It was brought to him by a flesh and blood messenger who looked him in the eyes. "My grandmother asked me to deliver it into your own hands," said Wakun, "and to tell you that this is the last one, that she won't write anymore, because she has no time left. Her name is Remigia. She said you would know who she is." Remigia. Anselmo hadn't heard that name aloud in 40 years, and to hear it now, from the mouth of an unknown young man, was like receiving a blow he had spent 4 decades waiting for. He took the letter with a trembling hand. He didn't burn it. This time, for the first time, he didn't burn it. "Come in," he said, with a voice he didn't recognize. "Doa Transita, give the young man something to eat." That afternoon, locked in his room, Don Anselmo opened the letter. And he opened, after 40 years, the little wooden box. He took out all the old letters, laid them on the bed, and for the first time in his life allowed himself to remember. 40 years before, Anselmo was another man. Young, arrogant, sole heir to the hacienda, owner of the world at 25, and convinced that the world owed it to him. And he had loved a girl from the town, Remigia, daughter of a farmhand who milked his father's cows. He loved her truly, with the only honest devotion he was capable of in all his life, and for a whole summer he believed that that dark-eyed girl was worth more than all the agaves of the Altos together. But when Remigia became pregnant, Anselmo's father, old Don Casimiro, flew into a rage that shook the whole hacienda. A Quintero did not marry the daughter of a farmhand that had never been seen and would not be seen while he lived. He gave him a choice, coldly, like someone closing a cattle deal, the girl or the inheritance, one of the two, and forever. And Anselmo, who was young and was a coward and didn't yet know that cowardice is paid for one's whole life, chose the inheritance. He paid Remigia some money to go far away, to Guadalajara, with her shame and her child in tow, and forbade her to return to the town. He never knew his son. He never wanted to know if it was a boy or a girl, if it lived or died, if it went hungry or cold. He later married for convenience a good, quiet woman who died of fevers a few years later, without giving him children, as if God himself had decided that a man who abandons his own blood doesn't deserve to found a family. And he was left alone, brooding over a silence he himself had built, stone by stone, the way a prison is built. The letters were from Remigia. For 40 years, without fail, she had written to him. Not to ask him for money, that he understood that afternoon, reading them all in one go with clouded eyes and trembling hands. She wrote to tell him about the son, because she thought a father, even the worst of fathers, had the right to know. How he grew. How he learned to read at a school of nuns. How he became a good man despite having no surname or father to defend him. What his name was, Lorenzo. She told him, year by year, the whole life Anselmo had refused to look at. And he had burned them all, one by one, over 4 decades, out of cowardice, out of pride, to avoid facing the size of what he had done. The last letter, the one Wakun brought him, was different. It was written in the trembling hand of a sick woman, and it said things that broke what was left of Anselmo's soul. That night, Don Anselmo didn't sleep. He went out to the corridor, sat in his father's chair, and looked at the stars over the agaves. Wakun, who slept in the guest room for the first time in his life under a hacienda roof, came out on hearing the creak of the chair and sat on the step, at a prudent distance. "Did you know my grandmother?" asked the young man, carefully. Anselmo took a while to answer. When he did, his voice was different, older, more human. "Are you Lorenzo's son?" he asked in turn. "Yes, sir. My papa died 3 years ago. In an accident, at the factory where he worked. Since then, my grandmother and I have lived alone. She raised me too. Anselmo closed his eyes. The son he never knew had lived, had worked with his hands, had married, had had a son, and had died in an accident, all without him, the father, lifting a single finger or asking a single time about his fate. 40 years of burned letters were 40 years of a life he had decided not to look at. And that son, Lorenzo, before dying had given him a grandson, without knowing it, without intending it. The young man in front of him, with Ramia's dark eyes fixed on the fire of the corridor, was his grandson. Blood of his blood, the only one left to him in the world, arrived at his door on foot, dusty and without reproaches. Just when there was almost no time left to repair anything. For a moment, the words wouldn't come to Don Anselmo, and he had to swallow, slowly, before he could go on speaking. What Anselmo was about to discover that night, neither of them had imagined yet. "In the last letter," said Anselmo, slowly, "your grandmother asks me one thing, not money. She asks me to take you in, not to leave you alone in the world the way you left me, the way I left your father. Those are her words." Joaquin lowered his gaze. "I didn't come to ask you for anything, sir," he said, with dignity. "My grandmother sent me because it was her last wish. But I know how to earn my living. I don't want your hacienda or your money. I just fulfill the errand and leave." And in that phrase, in that simple dignity of a poor young man who had walked leagues to fulfill an errand and didn't come to collect anything in return, Anselmo recognized himself as never before in all his life. Because that young man had, at 20 years old and without a peso in his pocket, the integrity and the manhood that he had lacked having everything. The grandson was giving him, without knowing it, a lesson the grandfather had taken 40 years to begin to understand. The next morning, before Joaquin left, a visitor arrived at the hacienda whom Anselmo wasn't expecting. It was a man from the town, Crisforo Bauelos, a moneylender and owner of half the commerce of the region, accompanied by 2 men. Crisforo had a reputation for buying other people's debts and collecting them with usurer's interest, and he brought, in his hand, some papers. "Don Anselmo," said Crisforo, with a fox's smile, "I come on a delicate matter. It turns out I bought, some time ago, some old debts of your late father, Don Casimiro. Debts that were never paid and that, with the years and the interest, are worth today almost as much as this hacienda. I have here the promissory notes, signed in his own hand. I come to collect, or to keep San Anselmo. You decide." The past, which Anselmo had believed buried, came back to collect its old debt, but not the way he feared. Anselmo took the promissory notes and examined them. They were old, yes, his father's signature, yes, but something didn't add up. The dates, the amounts. He called Doa Trincita, who as a young woman had been the one who kept the house accounts before moving to the kitchen, and she, with her tired eyes, looked at the papers a long while. "Patron," said Doa Trincita, in a low voice, "these debts your papa paid. I myself entered the payments in the old book. These promissory notes should have been destroyed. Someone kept them to use them now that your papa can no longer contradict them." Crisforo went pale for an instant, but recovered his smile. "Gossip of an old servant," he said. "What counts is the paper. And the paper says, you owe me. In 3 days I'll be back. With the authorities, if necessary." When Crisforo left, Anselmo stayed thinking. He knew that the old account book, the one that would prove the payments, had disappeared years ago. Without it, the forged promissory notes would have force. And then it was Joaquin, the young man, who spoke. "Sir," he said. My grandmother keeps all my family's papers in a chest. And among those papers there are some old receipts that she never understood why your father gave her before she left the town. Receipts of payments from the hacienda. She used to say he gave them to her so she would have something to defend herself with someday. I saw them as a child. Anselmo looked at him without understanding, but Joaquin, with the same calm as before, completed. My grandmother always knew more than she let on, sir. And never, in 40 years, did she wish you any harm. Not even when she had the means to do it to you. That same afternoon, Anselmo sent Joaquin back to Guadalajara on his best horse, with money for the road and the promise that he would wait for him. The young man returned in 2 days with his grandmother's chest, and inside, wrapped in a cloth, were the receipts, the payments that Don Casimiro had made of those debts, signed and dated, that Remilla herself had kept for 40 years. The woman Anselmo had abandoned gave back to him, from her deathbed, the proof that was going to save his hacienda. When Crisforo returned on the 3rd day with a representative of the authorities and his well-rehearsed fox's smile, Anselmo waited for him in the corridor, sitting in his father's chair, with the receipts spread out on the plank table, and Joaquin standing at his side, firm, like a son who doesn't move from his father's side when the hour comes. Doa Trencita and the old farmhands had gathered in the patio, and also, little by little, in silence, people from the town had been arriving, because the news that the moneylender wanted to keep San Anselmo had run the way fire runs in dry agave, mouth to mouth, hut to hut, until it gathered half the town at the gate of the hacienda. Crisforo, said Anselmo, without getting up from the chair, with a calm he hadn't had in 40 years, here are the receipts of the payments my father made of those debts. Signed and dated, year by year, in his own hand, and in the hand of the usurer who collected them in his time. Your promissory notes were already settled before you were born into the business of stealing. What you bring isn't a debt, it's a fraud, and you know it. The representative of the authorities took the receipts, compared them with the promissory notes one by one, reviewed the dates in the morning light, and as he read, his face went on hardening toward Crisforo. Anyone could see, just by putting the papers side by side, that the payments were later and covered the amounts of the promissory notes entirely. These payments are later and cover the promissory notes in their totality, said the man of the authorities, raising his voice so the whole town would hear. Don Crisforo, you have come to collect a debt that was already paid, and you have come knowingly with papers you should have destroyed years ago. That has a name in the law, and it isn't pretty. I'm going to have to report it to Guadalajara. Crisforo found no words. He looked around at the whole town watching him in a closed and heavy silence. That same people he had squeezed with his usurer's loans for years, from whom he had taken lands and animals in peace, and he understood, all at once, that there he didn't have a single friend left, not one who would show his face for him. He gathered his forged papers with clumsy hands, climbed into his cart, and went off down the dirt road without anyone seeing him off, without anyone saying a word to him. There were no shouts. There were no blows. There was no jail that afternoon, though there would be later. There was only the silence of a whole town that finally saw the fall of the one who had been robbing it in the shadow of the law, and that silence was, for Crisforo, worse than any sentence. But the real matter of that afternoon wasn't Crisforo. When the moneylender left, Anselmo stayed looking at Joaquin, his grandson, the young man who had saved his hacienda without asking him for anything, with the proof the woman he had abandoned had left him. And the old man, who hadn't cried in 40 years, felt something break inside him. And it wasn't bad that it broke. Your grandmother saved me, said Anselmo, his voice breaking, after everything I did to her. She saved me. She used to say that resentment weighs more than any debt, answered Wakun, and that she preferred to leave light. Anselmo got up, went into his room, and came back with the rosary of black beads, the one he had kept 40 years in the little wooden box. It was Remigia's. She had left it to him the last time they saw each other, as young people, and he had kept it as the only penance of his cowardice. He put it in Wakun's hands. "Give it back to your grandmother," he said, "and tell her I'm going to go see her. That after 40 years, I'm going to go, if God gives me the time." 3 days later, Don Anselmo Quintero did what he hadn't done in 4 decades. He saddled his best horse, dressed in his Sunday clothes, and left his hacienda bound for Guadalajara, with his heart pounding as it hadn't pounded since he was young. He arrived in time. Barely, but he arrived. Remigia, old and sick, consumed by the illness that was taking her, recognized him from the bed as soon as he took off his hat in the doorway, and though she barely had voice left to speak, she smiled at him with the same dark eyes as when they were young. There were no reproaches. There was no need to say any of what was superfluous. Anselmo knelt beside the bed, took her dry hand between his, and asked her forgiveness in a low voice, and she, who had spent 40 years forgiving him in advance, caressed his graying head the way one comforts a child who arrives late. Just 2 old people holding hands, closing at last, before God. A circle that had stayed open 40 years. Remigia died in peace that same week, with her rosary of black beads back between her fingers, knowing that her grandson was no longer alone in the world, and that the man she had loved when young had, at last, become a man again. When autumn came, the hacienda of San Anselmo had changed completely. Though the stones were still the same stones as always, Wakun stayed to live with his grandfather, and learned, at the old man's hand, to ride a horse, to read the skies to know when the water would come, to tell the mature agave from the one that still had to wait. In the afternoons, when the heat fell, the 2 of them sat in the corridor, the old man in his father's cord chair, and the young man on the stone step, and they talked of everything and nothing until the sun went down. Anselmo talked more in those autumn months than in the previous 40 years together, as if he had 4 decades of words stored up, and suddenly it was urgent to release them all before his time ran out. He told Wakun about his father, about the altos, about when the agaves were barely planted. He told him, at last, about Lorenzo, the son he didn't know, and of whom he now knew every detail from Remigia's letters. Doa Trencita, who had served in that house more than 30 years of silence, heard the patron laugh for the first time one ordinary afternoon, and had to go into the kitchen to wipe her tears with her apron so no one would see her. The house that had lived silent 4 decades gradually filled with voices, with young footsteps in the patio, with the life it had so long lacked. The little wooden box, now empty of those unopened letters that had weighed so much, Anselmo cleaned and used to keep the photographs of Lorenzo that Wakun had brought him from Guadalajara, the portraits of the son that pride had stolen from him. And each night, before sleeping, he looked at them a while by the candlelight. One of those afternoons, watching the blue agaves blaze with sun, Wakun asked his grandfather if he didn't regret the lost years. "Every day," answered Anselmo. "But your grandmother taught me something, until her last day, that the door that opens out of compassion never comes too late for the one who dares to cross it. Because the door that opens out of compassion, even if it opens 40 years late, is still an open door, and through it the light can still come in. Sometimes the past doesn't come back to destroy us, but to give us the last chance to be who we should have been. And sometimes, the one we believed came to collect a debt comes in reality to forgive us it. Have you ever understood, too late, the love of someone who, though they didn't know how to express it, never stopped keeping a place for you in their life? If this story touched your heart, leave me your comment and tell me from which part of the world you're joining us. Give it a like, subscribe to Tales of the Old Country, and share this story with someone who needs to close a circle they left open. And that autumn afternoon, while the sun went down red over the agaves, and the old man and the young man shared in silence the last coffee of the day, the hacienda that had been silent for 40 years seemed, at last, to breathe easy.